Zara Chen stood at the entrance of Jefferson High School, her military-issued duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard where teenagers laughed and chatted, completely unaware that they were in the presence of someone who had seen 3 different star systems burn. At 17, Zara looked like any other student with her regulation school uniform and carefully styled black hair. But beneath the surface, every movement carried the precision of someone trained for combat. Her eyes swept the area automatically, cataloging exits, potential threats, and defensive positions. Old habits from the Centauri Wars died hard. The school administrator, Mrs. Patterson, had been briefed about Zara's unusual situation. Child soldiers were technically illegal, but when humanity faced extinction from the Vorthak Empire, desperate times called for desperate measures. Zara had been one of thousands of teenagers conscripted into the Colonial Defense Force when her colony world was invaded. That was 3 years ago. Now, with the war finally over and humanity victorious, the surviving youth soldiers were being reintegrated into normal society. Normal. The word felt foreign in Zara's mind as she watched a group of students argue passionately about who had the better lunch. She had once gone 4 days without food while hiding in the ruins of New Shanghai, listening to Vorthak hunting parties search for survivors. The bell rang, a sharp electronic sound that made Zara's hand instinctively move toward where her sidearm would have been. She caught herself and forced her hand to relax. There were no weapons here, no enemies. Just algebra and literature classes. Her first period was ancient history with Mr. Rodriguez, an enthusiastic teacher who was currently explaining the Roman Empire's military tactics. Zara found herself silently critiquing his explanations. Roman formations were impressive for their time, but they would have been useless against Vorthak plasma artillery. She kept these thoughts to herself, taking careful notes and trying to blend in. During the lesson about Hannibal crossing the Alps, a student named Brad made a joke about how easy it would be to defeat ancient armies with modern weapons. The class laughed, but Zara remained silent. She had learned that superior technology meant nothing without the will to use it effectively. The Vorthak had better weapons than humans for most of the war. Yet here she was, alive, while their empire was nothing but radioactive dust. When the teacher asked if anyone had questions about military strategy, Zara almost raised her hand. She had practical experience that could illuminate the discussion, but something held her back. How could she explain flanking maneuvers without mentioning the time her squad had outmaneuvered a Vorthak death squad on Kepler 442b? How could she discuss supply lines without thinking about the starving civilians they had failed to save on Europa Station? At lunch, Zara sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating her sandwich while observing the social dynamics around her. Groups formed and reformed with an intricate dance of hierarchy and belonging that was more complex than any military command structure she had navigated. A girl named Sarah approached her table hesitantly. "You're the new girl, right? I'm Sarah Kim. Mind if I sit here?" Zara nodded, gesturing to the empty chair. Sarah was clearly nervous but determined to be friendly. She chattered about classes, teachers, and weekend plans while Zara listened politely. It was strange to hear someone worry about pop, quizzes, and prom themes when Zara's biggest concerns used to be whether her unit would survive the next planetary bombardment. The conversation was interrupted when Brad, the same student from history class, approached with 2 friends. He had the swagger of someone who had never faced real adversity, and Zara recognized the type immediately. Every military unit had at least one soldier who confused loudness with leadership. "So, new girl," Brad said, sliding uninvited into a chair. "Sarah here says you transferred from some military academy. That's pretty hardcore for a girl." The casual sexism in his tone made Zara's jaw tighten slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. "Something like that," she replied quietly. "I bet it was one of those fancy prep schools where they make you march around and polish boots," Brad continued, clearly enjoying his audience. "Must be quite a shock coming to a real school where we actually have fun." Sarah looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but Brad was just getting started. He leaned back in his chair with false confidence, the kind Zara had seen in fresh recruits before their first real engagement. "I've always thought military stuff was kind of pointless," he declared. "I mean, who needs all that discipline and following orders when you can just think for yourself? I bet half those military academy kids would cry if they faced real pressure." The words hung in the air as Zara studied Brad's face. She could see the soft life written in his features, the assumption that the world was inherently safe because he had never known otherwise. Part of her wanted to educate him about real pressure, about watching friends die, about making life or death decisions while enemy fire lit up the sky around you. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "You might be surprised what people can handle when they have to." The lunch period ended before Brad could continue his commentary, and Zara gathered her things with military precision. As she walked to her next class, she caught Sarah's apologetic look and offered a small smile in return. It wasn't Sarah's fault that she lived in a world where Brad's ignorance was possible. Walking through the hallways, Zara reflected on the strange new battlefield she found herself navigating. High school had its own rules, its own dangers, and its own victories to be won. The question was whether someone who had learned to survive in the vastness of space could adapt to the confined social ecosystem of teenage life. The afternoon stretched ahead with biology class, where she would probably have to pretend she didn't know that Vorthak physiology was remarkably similar to Earth octopi, and then gym class, where she would need to carefully moderate her physical capabilities to avoid questions about why a 17-year-old girl could outperform the star athletes. As she settled into her desk for biology, Zara made a decision. She would master this new environment just as she had mastered combat, reconnaissance, and survival. High school might not be ready for her strength, but she would find a way to belong without losing the part of herself that had kept her alive when everything else had fallen apart. The teacher began discussing cellular reproduction, and Zara opened her notebook, ready to learn about a different kind of survival altogether. The gym echoed with the sound of sneakers squeaking against polished floors as Coach Martinez explained the rules of dodgeball. Zara changed into her gym clothes methodically, each movement economical and purposeful. Around her, other students chatted excitedly about the upcoming game, but she remained focused on the task ahead. Dodgeball was supposedly just a game, but Zara's tactical mind automatically began analyzing the environment. The gymnasium was approximately 40 meters long with multiple exit points, adequate lighting, and clear sight lines. The rubber balls they would use were soft projectiles, nothing like the plasma charges she had dodged on Titan Base, but the principles of evasion remained the same. When teams were chosen, Zara found herself grouped with Sarah and several other students, including a quiet boy named Marcus who wore thick glasses and looked like he would rather be anywhere else. The opposing team featured Brad and his friends, who were already engaging in aggressive posturing and trash talk. "All right, do girl," Brad called out during the team selection. "Hope you're ready to see how we play real games here." Zara simply nodded, taking her position on the back line. She had learned long ago that the best response to intimidation was competent action. Words were meaningless without the ability to back them up. The whistle blew and chaos erupted. Students rushed forward to grab balls from the center line while others hung back in defensive positions. Zara moved smoothly to retrieve a ball, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to snatch one before the opposing team could react. Her first throw was deliberately moderate, aimed at an easy target to avoid drawing attention to her capabilities. As the game progressed, Zara began to understand the social dynamics at play. This wasn't really about athletic competition. It was about establishing social hierarchy and belonging. Students who were hit early sat on the sidelines, some looking relieved to be eliminated, others frustrated by their quick defeat. Brad dominated the center of the court, throwing with aggressive force that made some students flinch even when they weren't his target. He had good aim and a strong arm, but his technique was sloppy and predictable. Zara filed this information away as she continued to play at a carefully moderated level. When Sarah was targeted by one of Brad's friends, Zara made a split-second decision. She moved laterally, intercepting the throw with her own ball while simultaneously launching a counterattack. Her movement was fluid, almost dance-like, and the precision of her throw eliminated the attacking student cleanly. "Nice shot," Sarah called out, clearly impressed. The game continued, and Zara found herself enjoying the physical activity despite its artificial nature. It reminded her of training exercises with her unit, though those had involved live ammunition and real consequences. Here, the worst outcome was mild embarrassment and sitting on a bench. As the teams dwindled, Zara, Marcus, and 2 other students remained on her side, while Brad and 3 teammates held the opposing court. The dynamic had shifted. with Brad clearly frustrated that the game wasn't going as easily as he had expected. "Come on, new girl," he taunted, bouncing a ball menacingly. "Let's see what that military academy taught you about real competition." Marcus looked nervous beside her, adjusting his glasses and clearly hoping to avoid becoming a target. Zara made another tactical decision. Instead of showcasing her abilities, she would protect her teammate while maintaining her cover. When Brad wound up for a powerful throw aimed directly at Marcus, Zara moved. Her combat training kicked in automatically as she stepped into the ball's path, catching it cleanly with both hands. The impact that would have knocked Marcus down was absorbed easily by her conditioned muscles. The gymnasium fell silent for a moment. Catching a ball thrown with that much force should have been difficult, but Zara had made it look effortless. She could see surprise in Brad's eyes, quickly followed by anger. "Lucky catch," he muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The game ended a few minutes later with Zara's team victorious. As students headed to the locker room, Sarah caught up with her. "That was amazing. Where did you learn to move like that?" Zara considered her response carefully. "Physical fitness was emphasized at my previous school," she said, which was technically true. The Colonial Defense Force had indeed emphasized physical conditioning, usually while under enemy fire. In the locker room, she overheard a conversation between two girls discussing her performance. "Did you see how she moved? It was like she knew exactly where the ball was going to be. Maybe she played professionally or something. Military academies probably have intense sports programs." Zara said nothing, focusing on changing back into her regular clothes. Her cover story was holding, but she would need to be more careful about demonstrating her capabilities. The goal was integration, not standing out. After school, she found herself walking home through the suburban neighborhood where her assigned guardian family lived. The Henderson family had volunteered through a government program to house reintegrating youth veterans. They were kind people who asked few questions and gave her space to adjust. The houses she passed were pristine examples of civilian prosperity, with manicured lawns and decorative gardens. Children played in front yards while parents watched from porches. It was the kind of peaceful domestic scene that the Colonial Defense Force had fought to preserve, but experiencing it firsthand felt surreal. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of someone calling her name. She turned to see Marcus jogging to catch up with her, his backpack bouncing awkwardly as he ran. "Hey, Zara, wait up," he panted as he reached her. "I wanted to thank you for what you did in gym class. Brad's been targeting me since freshman year and nobody's ever stepped in like that before." Marcus was genuinely grateful, and Zara could see sincerity in his expression. She had protected him instinctively, the same way she would have covered a fellow soldier, but here it carried different social implications. "It was just a game," she replied simply. "Maybe to you, but not to me. Look, I know you're new and probably trying to fit in, but if you ever need help with anything academic, I'm pretty good with computers and science stuff." The offer was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Zara had excelled in military training, but her formal education had been interrupted by 3 years of war. Having an ally who could help her navigate the academic requirements might prove valuable. "Thank you," she said. "I might take you up on that." As they reached the intersection where their paths diverged, Marcus hesitated before speaking again. "Can I ask you something? That military academy you went to, was it really that intense? Because the way you moved today, it was like you had actual combat training or something." The question was perceptive, and Zara studied Marcus more carefully. Behind his nervous exterior and thick glasses, there was an intelligent observer who noticed details others missed. He could become either an asset or a liability depending on how much he suspected. "Training was comprehensive," she said finally. "They believed in preparing students for various scenarios." Marcus nodded slowly as if processing information. "Well, anyway, thanks again. See you tomorrow." As he walked away, Zara continued toward the Henderson house, considering the complexities of her new situation. She had successfully navigated her first day, but challenges were already emerging. Brad represented the kind of aggressive personality that might continue to probe her background and capabilities. Sarah offered potential friendship but also the risk of closer scrutiny. Marcus was perceptive and grateful, which could prove useful but also dangerous if he began connecting dots about her real background. The suburban streets stretched ahead of her, lined with the dreams and aspirations of families who had never known war. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to blend in or stand out. new tests of her ability to be a normal teenager, when everything about her training and experience screamed otherwise. But tonight, she would do homework, eat dinner with the Hendersons, and pretend that algebra problems were the most complicated challenges she faced. The war was over, humanity had won, and now she had to win a different kind of battle entirely. The chemistry lab smelled of sulfur and cleaning solvents as students filed in for third period. Zara took her assigned seat next to a girl named Emma, who immediately began complaining about the complexity of molecular structures. Around them, other students grumbled about the upcoming test on chemical bonding. Dr. Williams, the chemistry teacher, was setting up an experiment involving combustion reactions. As she explained the safety procedures, Zara found herself mentally cataloging the potential hazards with professional precision. The Bunsen burners reminded her of the improvised explosive devices her unit had constructed from salvaged materials during the siege of Europa Station. Today we'll be observing how different elements burn, Dr. Williams announced, distributing samples of various metals. Remember, safety goggles at all times, and no sudden movements around open flames. The irony wasn't lost on Zara. She had once used magnesium flares to signal evacuation ships while Vorthak fighters strafed the landing zone around her. Now she was supposed to be impressed by a small strip of the same metal burning in a controlled laboratory setting. As the experiment began, Emma struggled to light her Bunsen burner. Her hands shook slightly as she attempted to adjust the gas flow, clearly nervous about working with fire. Zara watched for a moment before quietly reaching over to help. "Here," she said softly, adjusting the valve with steady hands. "You want a steady blue flame, not the yellow one you had?" Emma looked grateful but also curious. "You're really good with this stuff. Did your old school have better science labs?" Before Zara could answer, there was a sharp crack from across the room. Brad had been showing off, trying to create a larger flame than necessary, and had knocked over a beaker of chemical solution. The liquid spread across the lab bench and the acrid smell of spilled acid filled the air. Dr. Williams rushed over, but Zara was already moving. Her combat training had ingrained automatic responses to chemical hazards, and she could see that the acid was flowing toward an electrical outlet. Without thinking, she grabbed the emergency neutralizer and quickly contained the spill before it could create a more dangerous situation. "Excellent reaction time." "Ms. Chen," Dr. Williams said, clearly impressed, "have you had previous experience with chemical safety protocols?" The entire class was staring at her now, and Zara realized she had acted too quickly, too professionally. A normal student would have waited for the teacher to handle the situation, not immediately implemented hazmat containment procedures. "Basic safety training," she said simply, returning to her seat as Dr. Williams took over the cleanup. Brad, clearly embarrassed by his mistake and Zara's competent response, scowled from across the room. "Show off," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. After class, Emma caught up with Zara in the hallway. "That was really impressive back there. You handled that chemical spill like you'd done it 100 times before." "I just reacted," Zara replied, adjusting her backpack straps with military precision. "Well, I'm glad you did. Brad could have caused a real accident." Emma paused, studying Zara's face. "You know, you're different from the other transfer students we've had. There's something about the way you carry yourself, like you've seen things the rest of us haven't." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Zara had indeed seen things that would give most of these students nightmares for years. She had watched cities burn from orbit, held dying comrades in her arms, and made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. "Different how?" Zara asked carefully. "I don't know exactly. You're always alert, like you're expecting something to happen. And you move with this kind of confidence that's not normal for our age. My brother's in the military, and you remind me of him when he came home on leave." This was dangerous territory. Emma was clearly intelligent and observant, and her connection to an active military member meant she might recognize signs that others would miss. Zara would need to be more careful around her. "People adapt to their environments," Zara said diplomatically. "Different schools have different cultures." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah joining them as they walked toward the cafeteria. "Did you guys hear about the camping trip?" she asked excitedly. "Mr. Rodriguez is organizing a weekend wilderness survival exercise for extra credit in history class. We'd learn about how ancient peoples lived off the land." Emma groaned. "Sleeping on the ground and eating berries? No, thank you. But Zara's interest was piqued. Survival training was something she understood intimately. Her unit had survived for weeks in hostile environments with minimal supplies, using techniques that went far beyond what any high school course would cover. "It sounds interesting," she said. "You should totally sign up." Sarah enthused. It would be fun to have someone competent along. Half the class would probably give up if they had to start their own fire. The mention of fire starting made Zara smile slightly. She could start a fire with almost anything, having learned the skill during the brutal winter on Proxima Centauri b, when their heating systems failed, and the nearest supply drop was 3 weeks away. At lunch, the conversation continued as more students discussed the camping trip. Marcus had signed up, viewing it as an opportunity to practice wilderness photography. Several of the more outdoorsy students were planning to participate, but many others expressed skepticism about sleeping without modern amenities. "I don't understand why anyone would voluntarily make themselves uncomfortable," Brad declared from a nearby table. "We have technology for a reason. Roughing it in the woods is just pretending to be primitive." Zara listened to the discussion while eating her sandwich methodically. There was an innocence to their concerns about comfort and convenience that highlighted how far removed they were from real hardship. These students had never known hunger, never slept in a foxhole while enemy patrols searched for them, never had to choose between staying warm and staying hidden. After school, she found herself walking through the park with Sarah and Emma, who were still debating the merits of the camping trip. The park was well maintained with paved paths, decorative benches, and carefully pruned trees. It was beautiful in its ordered domesticity, but Zara couldn't help comparing it to the raw wilderness where she had learned to survive. "The thing is," Emma was saying, "I've never been camping in my life. My family always vacations at resorts with room service and heated pools." "It's not that bad," Sarah replied. "My dad took us camping when I was younger, though we had a fully equipped RV, so it wasn't exactly roughing it." Zara remained quiet, remembering nights when her squad had taken shelter in cave systems on hostile planets, sharing body heat to survive sub-zero temperatures while listening for the sound of approaching enemy scouts. Those experiences had taught her that comfort was a luxury, not a necessity, and that human adaptability was far greater than most people realized. "What about you, Zara?" Sarah asked. "Any camping experience?" "Some," Zara replied. "I think the trip could be educational." As they reached the intersection where their paths diverged, Emma stopped suddenly. "You know what? You've convinced me. If someone who's never done it before can be enthusiastic about wilderness survival, maybe it won't be as horrible as I imagine. Plus," Sarah added with a grin, "having Zara along means we'll have someone who actually seems to know what she's doing." As her friends walked away, Zara continued toward the Henderson house, considering the implications of the camping trip. It would be an opportunity to demonstrate useful skills without seeming unusual, since survival knowledge would be expected and valued in that context. But it would also require careful moderation of her abilities to avoid revealing the true extent of her training. The suburban street was quiet in the afternoon light, with children playing in yards and parents tending to gardens. It was a peaceful scene that represented everything the Colonial Defense Force had fought to protect. Now she had to find her place in this world without drawing attention to the darkness she carried inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she continued to navigate the complex social ecosystem of high school life. The camping trip loomed as both an opportunity and a risk, a chance to help her classmates while maintaining her carefully constructed cover story. But tonight, she would study chemistry formulas and practice being a normal teenager, even though her dreams would inevitably return to burning space stations and the friends she had left behind in the cold depths of space. The wilderness preserve stretched out before them like an ocean of green, with hiking trails winding through dense forest and rocky outcroppings. 23 students had signed up for the weekend survival exercise, along with Mr. Rodriguez and 2 parent volunteers who served as additional supervision. Zara shouldered her modest backpack, noting how overpacked most of her classmates were. Sarah struggled with an enormous camping bag that looked like it could supply a small expedition, while Emma carried what appeared to be half her bedroom in outdoor gear. Only Marcus traveled light with a simple pack containing the basics plus his camera equipment. "Remember, this is about learning historical survival techniques," Mr. Rodriguez announced as they gathered at the trailhead. "We'll be using methods that ancient peoples would have understood. No modern conveniences except for safety emergencies. Brad stood with his usual group, looking skeptical about the entire enterprise. He had brought minimal gear, clearly expecting the experience to be easier than advertised. How hard can it be? Zara heard him tell his friends. Humans lived this way for thousands of years. If cavemen could do it, so can we. The first challenge came sooner than expected. 2 hours into their hike, the group reached a stream that was running higher than anticipated due to recent rainfall. The designated crossing point was submerged, and the water moved with deceptive speed over slippery rocks. Mr. Rodriguez studied the situation with concern. "We might need to find an alternate route," he said, consulting his map. But Zara was already assessing the tactical situation. She could see a safe crossing pattern using the larger stones as stepping points, but it would require careful timing and balance. Without conscious thought, she began moving toward the water's edge. "Zara, wait," Sarah called out. "It looks dangerous." "It's fine," Zara replied, already committed to the crossing. She moved with fluid precision, each step calculated and purposeful. Her enhanced balance and spatial awareness, honed by years of moving through zero-gravity environments and unstable surfaces, made the crossing seem effortless. On the far side, she turned to assess the best way to help the others. "There's a safe path," she called back. "I can guide you across." One by one, she helped her classmates navigate the stream. Some, like Marcus, followed her instructions precisely and crossed without incident. Others, including Brad, initially refused her assistance but eventually had to accept help when their own attempts failed. "Lucky you're good at this stuff," Emma said breathlessly after reaching the other side. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Practice," Zara said simply, which was true enough. She had crossed far more dangerous terrain under enemy fire, but these peaceful woods hardly seemed like the place to mention that experience. As the day progressed, more challenges emerged. When Sarah's expensive water purification tablets were accidentally dropped into the stream, Zara quietly showed the group how to build a proper filtration system using sand, charcoal, and fabric. When Brad's attempt at fire starting with flint and steel proved futile after an hour of effort, Zara demonstrated the technique with subtle efficiency. "You're like a survival expert," Marcus observed as he photographed her work. "Your military academy must have had an incredible outdoor program." "They believed in practical skills," Zara replied, carefully maintaining her cover story while helping Emma identify edible plants. The real test came when they made camp for the night. The designated camping area was a clearing near a small lake, picturesque but exposed to wind and potential weather changes. Zara automatically began assessing defensive positions and escape routes before catching herself and focusing on more mundane concerns like tent placement and firewood gathering. As darkness fell, the group gathered around their campfire for dinner. The meal consisted of simple trail food, but to students accustomed to cafeteria meals and fast food, even basic camping fare seemed like an adventure. "This is actually kind of fun," Emma admitted, warming her hands by the fire. "I was expecting to be miserable, but there's something appealing about the simplicity." "Speak for yourself," Brad muttered from across the circle. "I'll take air conditioning and indoor plumbing any day." The conversation drifted to ghost stories and urban legends, typical campfire entertainment that Zara found oddly comforting. There was something universal about humans gathering around fire to share stories, a tradition that had probably remained unchanged since the species first discovered controlled combustion. But as the evening progressed, the temperature began dropping more rapidly than the weather forecast had predicted. What had started as a mild autumn night was becoming genuinely cold, and most of the students were underdressed for the conditions. "I don't think my sleeping bag is rated for this temperature," Sarah said, shivering despite her proximity to the fire. Mr. Rodriguez looked concerned as he checked his weather app. "The forecast didn't call for this kind of temperature drop. We might need to consider heading back early." Zara recognized the early signs of a potentially dangerous situation. Several students were already showing symptoms of mild hypothermia, and the night was only going to get colder. She could survive these conditions easily, but her classmates lacked both proper equipment and training. "We can share body heat," she suggested. "If people pair up in sleeping bags and we maintain the fire through the night, everyone should be fine." "That's actually standard cold weather survival protocol," Mr. Rodriguez agreed, looking relieved to have a practical solution. As the group reorganized their sleeping arrangements, Brad made a predictable complaint. This is ridiculous. We shouldn't have to huddle together like refugees just because the weather changed. The word refugees hit Zara like a physical blow. She remembered the evacuation of Kepler Station, where thousands of civilians had indeed huddled together in emergency shelters, while Vorthak bombardment lit up the sky outside. She remembered children crying from cold and hunger, while their parents tried to maintain hope in impossible circumstances. Sometimes adaptation is the difference between survival and death, she said quietly, but with an edge that made several students glance at her curiously. Throughout the night, Zara volunteered for fire watch duty, using her enhanced awareness to monitor both the campfire and her sleeping classmates. She found herself automatically checking on each person at regular intervals, ensuring that no one was developing serious cold-related problems. When Marcus woke up during her watch shift, he found her sitting motionless by the fire, alert and vigilant in a way that seemed almost supernatural. "Can't sleep?" he whispered. "Someone needs to maintain the fire," she replied. "Mr. Rodriguez is supposed to take the next watch in an hour." "I'm fine. Go back to sleep." Marcus studied her profile in the firelight. "You know, my brother always said that military training changes people. He said it's hard to turn off the hypervigilance even when you're safe." The observation was too perceptive, too close to the truth. Zara turned to look at him, wondering how much he had guessed about her real background. "Your brother sounds like a smart person," she said carefully. "He is. He also said that people who've seen real combat have trouble trusting that they're actually safe, even in peaceful situations." The words hung in the air between them. Marcus wasn't making an accusation, but he was clearly indicating that he suspected more about her background than she had revealed. "Sometimes experiences shape how we respond to situations," Zara said finally. Marcus nodded slowly. "Well, whatever experiences you've had, I'm glad you're here. Everyone's sleeping safely because you know what you're doing." As he settled back into his sleeping bag, Zara continued her vigil by the dying fire. Tomorrow they would return to civilization, to the comfortable illusion of safety that high school represented. But tonight in the wilderness under a canopy of stars, she could admit to herself that some part of her felt more at home here than in any classroom. The fire crackled softly as she added another log, and in the distance she could hear the peaceful sounds of her classmates sleeping safely through the night. It was a small victory, but victories in any form were worth celebrating. The Monday morning after the camping trip brought a noticeable shift in the social dynamics at Jefferson High School. Word had spread about Zara's competence in the wilderness, and she found herself the subject of increased attention from both students and teachers. "You should have seen her," Sarah was telling a group of students at lunch. "She knew exactly what to do in every situation. It was like having a professional guide with us." Zara ate her sandwich quietly while the conversation swirled around her. The attention was uncomfortable, but she understood it was probably unavoidable. Her skills had been too obvious to hide completely, and now she would have to manage the consequences. Emma joined the discussion with enthusiasm. "She saved us from freezing that first night. Without her fire maintenance and sleeping arrangement suggestions, half of us would have been hypothermic. I heard Brad almost got frostbite because he refused to follow her advice initially," another student added. From across the cafeteria, Zara could see Brad sitting with his usual group, looking sullen and frustrated. He had indeed suffered mild frostbite on his toes after insisting he could handle the cold alone, only to accept help when his situation became genuinely dangerous. The increased attention brought both opportunities and risks. Teachers began asking her opinion on various topics, clearly impressed by her practical knowledge and mature perspective. But with greater visibility came greater scrutiny, and Zara knew she would need to be even more careful about maintaining her cover story. The real test came during Wednesday's current events discussion, social studies class. Mrs. Patterson had assigned students to present on recent news stories, and the topic of military conflicts naturally arose. "The Centauri Wars officially ended 6 months ago," Brad announced to the class, clearly having done minimal research. "It was basically a lot of space battles that didn't affect us here on Earth very much." Zara felt her jaw tighten at the casual dismissal. The Centauri Wars had affected everyone, even if Earthbound civilians didn't fully understand the stakes. Billions of lives had hung in the balance. Entire colonies had been destroyed, and thousands of young people like herself had been forced into combat to ensure humanity's survival. Actually, Marcus interjected, the war had significant implications for all human colonies. Supply lines were disrupted, trade routes were compromised, and there were refugee crises on multiple worlds. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. Good points, Marcus. Does anyone else have insights about the broader impact of the conflict? Several hands went up, but Zara remained silent despite having more first-hand knowledge than the rest of the class combined. She watched as her classmates shared second-hand information from news reports and internet articles, their understanding limited to sanitized media coverage that had downplayed the true horror of the conflict. I read that they used child soldiers in some of the outer colonies, Emma said hesitantly. That seems really horrible. It was a desperate situation, Mrs. Patterson replied carefully. When entire populations were threatened with extinction, normal rules had to be suspended temporarily. Brad scoffed from his seat. I don't buy that. There's no way kids could be effective in real combat situations. It was probably just propaganda to make the enemy look worse. The casual dismissal of her comrades' sacrifices hit Zara like a physical blow. She thought of Chen Wei, barely 15 when he died holding a defensive position on Europa Station. She remembered Maria Santos, 17, who had piloted evacuation ships through enemy fire to save civilian populations. The idea that their contributions were propaganda made her hands clench beneath her desk. Sometimes, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the classroom chatter, people are capable of more than others expect them to be. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Mrs. Patterson looked curious about her contribution, while several students seemed surprised by the intensity in her voice. That's an interesting perspective, Zara, the teacher said. Do you want to elaborate? For a moment, Zara considered telling them the truth. She could describe the reality of watching 14-year-olds operate plasma artillery while their homes burned behind them. She could explain how desperation transforms ordinary teenagers into soldiers who make impossible decisions under enemy fire. Instead, she chose her words carefully. History shows that when survival is at stake, people often exceed normal expectations. Age becomes less important than competence and determination. But they were just kids, another student protested. How could children be expected to handle that kind of responsibility? Maybe the question isn't about age, Marcus said thoughtfully, but about what circumstances force people to become. My brother says military service changes people fundamentally. Zara glanced at Marcus, noting once again his perceptive observations. His brother's military background was giving him insights that other students lacked, and she could see him making connections that made her nervous. The important thing, Mrs. Patterson said, steering the discussion back on track, is that the war is over and humanity prevailed. Now we have to focus on rebuilding and reintegration. The word reintegration hit closer to home than the teacher realized. Zara was living proof of that challenge, trying to blend into civilian society while carrying memories that her classmates couldn't imagine. After class, Sarah caught up with her in the hallway. You seemed really affected by that discussion about child soldiers. It must be hard to think about kids our age going through something like that. It is, Sarah replied honestly. War affects everyone, not just the adults who make the decisions. I can't imagine being forced into that situation. How do you think someone our age would even cope with real combat? The question was innocent, but it forced Zara to confront the gap between her lived experience and her friend's understanding. How could she explain that coping wasn't really an option? You simply did what was necessary or you died, and somehow the mind adapted to process unthinkable realities. People are more resilient than they know, she said finally. When there's no choice, you find strength you didn't know you had. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma and Marcus, both looking excited about something. Guess what? Emma announced. The school is organizing a fundraiser for war refugee assistance. They want student volunteers to help coordinate donation drives and awareness events. That sounds like a good cause, Marcus agreed. My brother mentioned that a lot of displaced families are still struggling to rebuild their lives. Sarah looked enthusiastic. We should totally get involved. After our camping trip, I feel like our group works really well together. Zara felt conflicted about the proposal. Supporting refugee assistance was important work that aligned with her values. But it would also involve discussing topics that hit very close to her own experience. She would have to be careful not to reveal too much personal knowledge about the realities of displacement and trauma. "I think it's worth doing," she said carefully. "People who've lost everything deserve help rebuilding their lives." As they walked toward their next classes, Marcus fell into step beside her. "You know, you always seem to have really thoughtful perspectives on these issues. It's like you understand things on a deeper level than most people our age." The observation was becoming a pattern with Marcus, and Zara realized she needed to deflect his growing curiosity before he asked more direct questions. "I just think it's important to consider different viewpoints," she replied. Military Academy encouraged critical thinking about complex issues. "Must have been quite an academy," Marcus said with a slight smile that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanations. That afternoon, as Zara walked home through the peaceful suburban neighborhood, she reflected on the increasing complexity of her situation. The camping trip had elevated her status among her peers, but it had also attracted more attention than she was comfortable with. Marcus was clearly suspicious about her background, though he seemed content to hint rather than confront directly. The Refugee Assistance Project presented both an opportunity and a risk. She could contribute meaningfully to important work, but she would need to be careful not to reveal the extent of her personal knowledge about displacement, trauma, and survival. Most challenging of all was the growing realization that she genuinely cared about these people who had become her friends. Sarah's enthusiasm, Emma's determination to overcome her fears, Marcus's quiet perceptiveness. They had become important to her in ways she hadn't expected. The mission was no longer just about blending in and completing her reintegration. It had become about finding a way to belong while protecting both her cover and the people she was learning to care about. As she reached the Henderson house, Zara made a decision. She would participate in the Refugee Assistance Project, but she would use it as an opportunity to help others while maintaining careful control over what she revealed about herself. It was a delicate balance, but then again, her entire life since the war had been about finding balance between her past and her future. The suburban evening stretched peacefully ahead, filled with homework and family dinner and all the normal routines of civilian life. But beneath the surface, Zara carried the weight of secrets and the challenge of being someone who had seen too much trying to live among those who had seen too little. The Refugee Assistance fundraiser had transformed the school gymnasium into a bustling center of activity. Tables lined the walls displaying information about displaced families, reconstruction efforts, and opportunities for community support. Students moved between stations with clipboards and donation forms, their enthusiasm genuine even if their understanding of the issues remained limited. Zara stood at the information booth she had helped organize, watching as her classmates engaged with materials that documented the aftermath of the war she had fought. The sanitized presentation spoke of displaced populations and reconstruction challenges without mentioning the screams of children during orbital bombardments or the smell of burning settlements that still haunted her dreams. "This is really eye-opening," Sarah said, reviewing a pamphlet about colony rehabilitation programs. "I had no idea so many people were still struggling to rebuild their lives." Emma nodded agreement while organizing donation envelopes. "It makes our problems seem pretty trivial in comparison. Like, who cares about pop quizzes when families are living in temporary shelters?" The conversation was interrupted by Brad's arrival at their booth. He had been noticeably hostile since the camping trip, his ego apparently still bruised by having to accept help from someone he had initially dismissed. "So this is where the bleeding hearts are gathering," he said with his characteristic sneer. "Let me guess, you want us to feel guilty about having comfortable lives while other people suffer?" "It's about helping people who need assistance," Marcus replied calmly, adjusting his glasses. "That seems like a basic human responsibility." "Right, because throwing money at problems always fixes everything," Brad continued. "These people probably just need to work harder and stop depending on handouts." The casual cruelty of his words struck Zara like a physical blow. She thought of the families she had evacuated from burning colonies, people who had lost everything through no fault of their own. She remembered children who had watched their parents die defending evacuation ships, and elderly civilians who had survived orbital bombardments only to face starvation in refugee camps. "Sometimes," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that made several students look up, "people lose everything despite working as hard as they can. Sometimes survival itself requires more strength than most people will ever understand. Brad turned his attention to her with obvious satisfaction. Oh, right, I forgot. You're our resident expert on hardship because you went to some fancy military academy. Tell me, princess, what do you really know about real suffering? The word princess was designed to be dismissive, but it triggered something deeper in Zara's memory. She remembered the last transmission from Kepler Station's commander before the base fell. Tell them we held the line. Tell them the princess made it out. The princess had been her call sign, earned during a rescue operation, where she had single-handedly extracted a team of civilians from behind enemy lines. For a moment, the gymnasium faded away and she was back in her combat armor, watching Vorthak fighters streak across an alien sky, while her unit prepared for what they knew would be their final stand. She could smell the ozone from plasma discharge and feel the weight of her rifle in her hands. Hey, Marcus said gently, placing a hand on her arm. You okay? The touch brought her back to the present. She realized she had been staring at Brad with an intensity that was making several students uncomfortable. Her hands were clenched at her sides and she could feel the familiar combat readiness flooding through her system. I'm fine, she said, forcing her voice to remain level. But Brad wasn't finished. You know what I think? I think this whole refugee thing is just an excuse for people to feel good about themselves without actually solving anything. And I think some people use their supposed difficult backgrounds to get attention and sympathy they don't deserve. The implication was clear, and Zara felt something cold and dangerous rising in her chest. This privileged boy who had never known real hardship was questioning the legitimacy of suffering he couldn't comprehend. Brad, that's enough, Sarah said firmly. There's no need to be cruel. I'm just being realistic. Real strength means taking care of yourself, not depending on others to solve your problems. Real strength, Zara said slowly, her voice carrying a quality that made the entire booth fall silent, is doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. It's watching friends die and continuing the mission anyway. It's making decisions that will haunt you forever because the alternative is letting innocent people suffer. She stepped closer to Brad, and despite being smaller than him, something in her posture made him instinctively step back. Real strength is a 14-year-old girl holding a defensive position while evacuation ships escape, knowing she probably won't survive but doing it anyway because someone has to. It's carrying wounded comrades through hostile territory for 3 days without sleep, because leaving them behind isn't an option. The gymnasium had grown quiet around them, other students sensing the intensity of the confrontation. It's lying awake at night remembering the faces of people you couldn't save, and getting up the next morning to try again because giving up means more people die. Real strength is learning to live with nightmares so that others can sleep peacefully. Brad's face had gone pale, and Zara realized she had said too much. The raw pain in her voice, the specific details she had mentioned, the way she held herself like a soldier reporting to a superior officer. It all painted a picture that her cover story couldn't explain. Zara, Emma whispered, her eyes wide with recognition. You're not talking about military academy, are you? The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Around the booth, her friends stared at her with varying expressions of shock, understanding, and concern. Marcus looked like pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place, while Sarah seemed to be reassessing everything she thought she knew about her new friend. For a moment, Zara considered maintaining her deception. She could claim she was speaking hypothetically, deflect with another carefully crafted explanation about her educational background, but looking at the faces of people who had become important to her, she realized she was tired of lying to them. No, she said quietly, I'm not. The admission settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Brad looked confused and slightly frightened, clearly out of his depth. The other students seemed to be processing the implications of what she had revealed. You were actually there, Marcus said softly. In the war? You're one of those youth soldiers the news talked about. Zara nodded slowly, feeling both relief and fear at finally acknowledging the truth. Colonial Defense Force, 47th Reconnaissance Unit. 3 years active service across 4-star systems. Emma's hand covered her mouth in shock. You were just a kid. How old were you when it started? 14 when my colony was attacked. 15 when I enlisted. The Vorthak Empire didn't care about our ages when they decided to exterminate humanity. Sarah reached out tentatively and took her hand. All this time you've been carrying that alone. Why didn't you tell us? Because I wanted to be normal, Zara replied, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. I wanted to be a regular teenager worried about homework and social drama, not someone who's seen entire worlds burn. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Patterson approaching their booth. Is everything all right over here? I heard raised voices. The group exchanged glances, and Zara saw her friends making a silent decision to protect her secret. Just a disagreement about fundraising strategies, Marcus said smoothly. We've worked it out. Mrs. Patterson looked skeptical but nodded. Well, keep it civil. This is about helping people, not scoring debate points. As the teacher moved away, Brad cleared his throat uncomfortably. Look, I didn't know. I was just being an ass, Emma finished bluntly. Apologize. I'm sorry, Brad said, and for once his arrogance was completely absent. I had no right to say those things. Zara studied his face and saw genuine remorse there. The revelation had clearly shaken him, forcing him to confront the reality that some people had experienced hardships beyond his imagination. It's fine, she said. You couldn't have known. But it wasn't really fine, and they all knew it. The dynamic between them had shifted permanently. She was no longer the mysterious transfer student with the interesting background. She was a combat veteran trying to navigate teenage life. Someone who had seen and done things that would give her classmates nightmares. As the fundraiser continued around them, her friends rallied with touching loyalty. They didn't ask for details about her service or press her for war stories. Instead, they simply accepted this new information and continued treating her as the person they had come to care about. For what it's worth, Sarah said as they cleaned up at the end of the day, you're still just Zara to us. The girl who helped us across the stream and kept us warm when we were camping. And who somehow makes chemistry class less terrifying, Emma added with a small smile. Marcus was quiet as they packed up the remaining materials. But when they were alone for a moment, he spoke thoughtfully. My brother always said that the hardest part of coming home from war isn't the combat memories. It's learning to trust that you're actually safe, that you can care about normal things again without feeling guilty. His insight was uncomfortably accurate. Zara had indeed struggled with the guilt of enjoying peaceful moments while her fallen comrades would never experience them. Your brother sounds like he understands, she said. He also said that talking about it helps when you're ready, and that the people who care about you want to help carry the weight, even if they can't fully understand it. As they walked out of the gymnasium together, Zara reflected on the day's events. Her carefully maintained cover was blown, but perhaps that wasn't entirely bad. The burden of secrecy had been heavier than she had realized, and having friends who knew the truth might actually make her reintegration easier. The suburban evening stretched ahead, no longer filled with the pretense of being someone she wasn't. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of her revelation spread through the school. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at Jefferson High, she could simply be herself, a survivor learning to live again, supported by friends who accepted her despite the darkness she carried. The war was over, humanity had won, and now she was finally ready to win the peace as well.